So about a month ago, I did a video here on the channel, partnered up with WhiteWall, just showing you how to prepare your photographs for printing at a fine art lab to get the best results possible. And we had a second video lined up, and I thought it could be cool to kind of switch things up a little bit, take this opportunity to jump onto WhiteWall's website and basically try out a bunch of different fine art papers and printing and display methods that I normally wouldn't try or haven't tried before, as a way to potentially discover something new, maybe find a new favorite, and also just introduce you to some different options. So today we're gonna look at 7 different fine art papers, 2 different printing methods with those, and I have one color and one black and white image, the same one for all of the papers, just so we can get a feel for how they differ. And then we're gonna look at 3 different framing and display methods. And as mentioned, I've partnered up with WhiteWall for this video again, and if you aren't familiar with them, they're a professional fine art print lab based out of Germany, and I've actually been using them for quite a long time now, so cool to be able to do some work here on the channel with them. And what I've always loved about WhiteWall is they just have like a huge variety of different papers and mounting and display methods to choose from. You know, a lot of high quality professional fine art papers, really tasteful display options as well. And the quality has always been amazing. So I highly recommend checking them out. If you'd like to, they're offering anyone watching this video 10% off their order, and I'll put a link or a code below for that. Okay, so let's jump into it. We're gonna start by taking a look at these fine art papers. And as mentioned, 7 different papers, 2 different ways. I did some inkjet prints and then a few C-type or digital C-type prints, which I'll kind of describe later. We're gonna start by taking a look at the inkjet prints, 4 different papers. And also for all of these, it's worth mentioning, I just used my workflow that I used in the previous video, sized and sharpened, but I didn't do any soft proofing or color adjustments, which I normally would do, just because I thought this could kind of be like a cool opportunity to see how these papers differ from one another and see kind of how far each one is away from being accurate to the original image. So first up, we're going to take a look at a couple gloss or luster style papers. So the first paper we're going to look at is Hahnemühle Fine Art Baryta. And this is described as a warmer, bright white paper with impressive color reproduction, and the coating on this makes it reminiscent of the classic Baryta papers of the past. The first thing that jumps out at me with this paper is just the feel of it. It's got like a really nice kind of weight to it, little bit of warmth, and then it's this texture on it. And this Baryta style finish, you know, it's quite heavy, but it looks really nice. It's winning me over very, very quick. Color and saturation, what's impressed me quite a bit is that, you know, I skipped soft proofing, I skipped making any adjustments, and this print as is, right out of the box, looks pretty accurate compared to my source file that I started with. Just the balance of the image looks great. Black and white version, more of the same. You know, the image I chose for this test has a lot of dark areas with subtle tone changes, and this paper specifically has done a great job like retaining that in these really dark areas. I was worried with some of these that it was gonna block those tones up and struggle to reproduce those subtle changes. So overall, this might be a new favorite very quickly as the first one out of the box. Really enjoying this. Next up is Epson Traditional Photo Paper, and this is described as having a smooth satin finish that depicts black and darker tones quite deep. And this has a Dmax of 2.25, so quite high, actually the highest out of all the papers on WhiteWall's website. So first impressions with this one, the paper feels maybe just like a little bit lighter compared to the Hahnemühle, and maybe just a touch cooler, but still has a great feel to it. Finish on this, you know, nice kind of silk satin finish, quite a bit less of like a chunky texture to it compared to the Baryta paper we looked at. But if you look close, it still does have a little bit of texture. So I actually quite enjoy the look of this paper. But when it comes to color and contrast, this is very, very similar to the Hahnemühle paper. You know, the accuracy of it looks really good as well. I think I'd be fine rolling with this without soft proofing and adjustments, just sizing and sharpening. If anything, it's maybe like just a little bit more punchy compared to the Hahnemühle, but it does look nice. You know, these are like very minimal differences. This black and white image, you know, also very happy with how this one turned out. But I will say the one thing I did notice is that these dark areas are lacking just a little bit of detail compared to that Hanamule, which isn't too surprising, just from the description of this paper, but it seems like those really subtle changes in tones in this image are just blocking up a touch more compared to the Baryta paper. But overall, both of these papers that we looked at for gloss and luster, I'm quite happy with. And it's cool to see that you could kind of take either one, size, sharpen, send away, and get back an image that's gonna look pretty much like what you had on your screen. Okay, so next up, we're gonna take a look at some matte or rag style papers. And I've always just preferred like a gloss or a luster for reproducing contrast and saturation, especially doing landscape stuff back in the days. So I was kind of skeptical on how much I would like this. So the first one in this category is another Hanamule paper. This is their photo rag. And this is described as having a very matte surface with a fine understated texture. And Dmax on this paper is 1.82. So this is definitely a matte paper. The finish is very, very flat, but the texture on this is actually quite nice. These Hanamule papers have just had this very nice texture on both of them. But I will say color reproduction and contrast with this color image surprised me. So I'm actually quite a big fan of how this looks. I thought I wouldn't be, just lacking any type of like sheen or gloss to it. I thought would just make it seem too flat, but this is really growing on me. And this is something I wouldn't have used in the past. It does seem maybe a little bit punchy and like it has potentially a little bit of a cast to it. So I think if I was working with this in the future, I would absolutely proof and probably make really minor adjustments. But this paper surprised me. Black and white though, this is where I could potentially see myself going off of these matte papers. So with the style of imagery that I do with black and white, these papers do start to struggle a little bit in those really dark areas where you have those subtle changes in tones that I was talking about earlier. So don't know if this is a paper that I would use for black and white, but for color, it is something that is quickly growing on me. So next up is the Canson Rag Photographique. This is described as having a brilliant white, warm tint finish with understated texture. And Dmax on this one is quite a bit lower than the last at 1.56. So looking at the color version first, very matte, just like the previous paper, obviously. Little bit of a texture to this, not as noticeable compared to the Hanamule. But the first thing that jumps out at me is just the difference in color. So this is definitely not as punchy compared to the previous paper we looked at. And it's almost like it's lacking a little bit of contrast, and then the whites and the bright areas seem like a little more neutral and a bit brighter. So right out of the box, I definitely prefer the other paper. This one didn't do a bad job, but I still think for me as someone who isn't a huge fan of matte papers, if I were gonna choose between the two, I would definitely go with the previous one we looked at. I will say though, with the black and white version, this is where I noticed a difference. So in these really deep black areas, the Hanamule noticeably did a better job producing like a richer black or a deeper black, which makes sense because it has quite a bit higher Dmax compared to the Canson paper. So again, this wouldn't be my first choice for black and white printing. So next up is C-type prints. And if you aren't familiar with digital C-type printing, what this is an image printed on traditional darkroom photo paper. But obviously we aren't working with a negative and an enlarger. What they're doing is taking our digital image and using a special type of printer, which exposes that image onto photo paper using colored lasers. And then that paper is taken and developed traditionally in a darkroom. So an interesting way to work. And there's a bunch of different ways you can do this. I did 3 different types of papers. If you go on WhiteWall's website, there's a number of them listed under the photo print section. So first up, I did a lambda print on Fuji Crystal Archive Silk. And this is a classic photo paper and it has a very wide color gamut and density. So right away, the first thing that jumps out at me with this print is just the feel of the paper. It doesn't have the same density as those fine art papers. I used the silk option for this Fuji paper. You can do gloss, matte, and I think there's maybe one other, but I'm actually not really a big fan of how this looks. It has this interesting texture to it, but it just doesn't feel as like organic as those fine art papers. I don't really like it as much. And then color, this is definitely one that you would want to soft proof and do adjustments. And I've noticed that in the past. I've always felt that this paper looks like a little bit magenta, almost, a little cooler. So this is one that I wouldn't recommend just sending your image off and crossing your fingers. So as it is, you know, you could definitely get this image looking better than it does right now. But the colors, you know, they look pretty good. Saturated, contrast is good. And if you made the proper adjustments, I think this paper would look pretty great. But I would say my dislike is more so just with like the feel of the paper and the texture. It's not terrible, but I just couldn't see myself choosing something like this over that, say, Hanamule paper we looked at earlier. Okay, the second one is another Fuji paper, and this is a newer option called Fuji Crystal Archive Maxima. And this is on WhiteWall's website under Ultra HD photo print. And as mentioned, this is a newer paper. Apparently it has an even wider gamut than the previous one we looked at and produces finer detail, better shadow detail. So I was very curious to see how this looks. And I will say, first impressions with this, it's a gloss paper for sure. This is the only finish that you can get right now, at least through WhiteWall. I'm not a fan of this look at all. Doesn't mean it's bad, but it's just super glossy. And for my style of imagery, I'm not a big fan at all. Color, again, this is one, looking at this image right now, you would definitely want to soft proof and do adjustments. This has like a warm kind of greenish cast to it, so you would need to make some tweaks for sure before printing. You know, this paper obviously is going to be able to handle saturation and color, and I'm sure has a ton of potential. You just need to tweak it right. But the biggest standout, as mentioned in their description, better shadow detail, better detail overall. And I will say this paper looks incredibly sharp to the point where this, as it is right now, looks way too sharp, like completely over sharpened. And I think if this were something I was going to use in the future, I would have to tweak my workflow that I use for printing and prepping for all of the other fine art papers I've used in the past, because this is definitely overdone as is. Okay, and the last C-type print we're going to look at is a light jet print on Ilford black and white paper. So this comes in a gloss and a matte finish. I ordered the matte finish, but I will say this still has a sheen to it. It looks to me like more of a silk, but it's not too bad. I think I'd be happy with this. Just like the other C-types, you know, the weight and the feel of this paper isn't as nice compared to the fine art papers we were looking at. But the biggest thing really with this is just that it's lacking contrast and the blacks are quite kind of muddy. So not that there's anything wrong with this process or this paper. This is kind of just showing me that if you were to use this, or if I were going to use it in the future, this is something that you would definitely want to soft proof and make adjustments. And I'm sure if you did that, you could get your image looking very, very nice. Okay, and the last thing we're going to look at are a few different display and framing methods. And as mentioned, you know, in the past, I kind of stuck with like one approach and was always a fan of something like a little more subtle, traditional. But what I've loved about WhiteWall, they have all sorts of different options. They have like acrylic and metal for mounting and stuff like that. But it's all really kind of simple and tasteful. There's a lot of variety, but it's nothing kind of too wild and out there. So figured I would try a couple different options that caught my eye. So the first one that I decided to check out was a fine art print on aluminum dye bond. Okay, and I wanted to start with this one because this is probably my new favorite way of displaying and framing, which I said in the last video, but I'll explain. So what this is a fine art print on the paper you choose. So I chose the Hanamule Fine Art Baraita that we looked at earlier. And it's then mounted to a piece of dye bond, which is like a aluminum backing or metal backing board. And then it just has this coating applied to the front. So there's no glass or anything. And then I chose this just like simple black float frame. So there's a nice little kind of gap in between the print itself and the frame. You can get this without a frame if you want and just have the dye bond as is. But this just has such a nice feel to it. Super simple and tasteful, and I like that there's nothing between the print and the viewer. There's no glass. So this has won me over quick. This is a really cool way to present. I think this combination with the Hanamule paper, mounted like this with the float frame, just for me suits my taste really well. Next up, we're going to check out a photo print on wood. And this is something that I definitely would never probably choose if I weren't doing this video, but I wanted to try something different. I thought it could be an interesting option to explore. So what this is a C-type print, so Fuji Crystal DP2 that we looked at earlier, either gloss or matte finish. I chose matte. And then it's simply just mounted to a piece of plywood and you have the live edge exposed. So very simple, you know, some mounting holes on the back. And it's kind of cool. I don't know if I would use this for anything moving forward. It's just maybe not my style, but with the right image, something with a lot of color, abstract images, it is kind of a cool way to display in something different that's not like out there, but is a little bit different than the norm. Okay, and lastly, we're gonna take a look at a photo print under matte acrylic glass. And if you watched my last video, this one will look familiar, but I wanted to make another for anyone who didn't see that video or for anyone who doesn't check that video, because this method was my kind of new favorite until I did that dye bond print. So this is really cool. What this is a C-type print, Fuji Crystal DP2, and then it's mounted with acrylic glass over top. It really kind of transforms this and makes it seem like there's nothing between you in the image, similar to that dye bond one. So this is really neat. And then I just chose not a floater frame for this, but just a simple wooden frame with like a whitewash to it. So I like that you can kind of get creative on WhiteWall's website and pair different frame colors with whatever the colors are in your image. Okay, so that pretty much wraps this big test up, and I hope this introduces you, gives you some ideas, inspires you to print your work. And if you're a photographer and you don't print your work, honestly, it's something you have to do. And that doesn't mean you need to go and print 40 or 50 images, but even just like picking one of your favorites and trying it out, you know, it's the final piece of the process, and it really does make images take on a different life. So I hope you enjoyed this one. Like I said, if you want to try WhiteWall, code below, 10% off, definitely check them out. And other than that, just want to say thank you for watching this video. Hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you soon with another.